So honored to have you, Bruce. Please come on down and make your presentation. I love your background too. You've got quite a machine going on there with Human Studio.
Thank you. Yes, we're not, I'd like to say I'm on a beach, but we're not. We're actually in the office, which is a pleasure of ours. So one of the great pleasures of these kinds of events is I get to have a greater understanding of someone whose work I don't really know. I was not aware of the work of Alain previous to Sam and Lynn introducing me to his and his partner's ideas. So that's great for us. I want to cover a lot of ground at a high level today, and I want to be very respectful of my co-presenters and try and do it quickly. I'll start with a couple of thoughts on Alain's work and then use those thoughts to lead into two research and tool building projects that our office is doing that in my mind are directly compatible with Alain's ideas. One of the perspectives he brings to urban city building is that we suffer from a crisis of overregulation. And one answer to overregulation is reducing the role of formal planning and increasing the role of economics in decision-making. Put another way, I believe Alain's perspective is that people know what they want better than bureaucrats do. As a co-founder of a practice called Human Studio, I'm passionate and curious about the interaction of people in the city. And I do agree that in our context of British Columbia, the problem of overregulation, or more precisely overlapping regulation, is a serious impediment to building an inspirational and humane city. But I would not want to imply that I support the idea that the market is the only answer. To make a single critique of the market-focused idea, I strongly feel that markets must have open information to be a real representation of human desire. In particular, an area that I think is underexamined is how people make decisions about appropriate types of housing, an issue which Alain discusses frequently. Unfortunately, good information about housing choices in North America is sharply curtailed by the fact that local media is strongly dominated by real estate advertising. This is a personal bugbear of mine, because this means that there is not responsible or professional journalism, not a responsible or professional journalism culture talking about real estate development at all. It's dramatically easier, for example, to find out whether a movie you're planning to see is a stinker than it is to get any real information about buying a house, which is for most people the largest investment they will ever make. It's hugely difficult to tell, for example, if a developer you're considering buying from has been sued for leaky condo disasters. But you can get lots of skinny pictures of skinny people leaning over fancy countertops and real estate ads. Just a bugbear with the market. But it's easy to be a critic. Let's talk about solutions by moving on to where our thinking overlaps with Alain's, the importance of understanding how people actually inhabit the city. In order to have a perspective on this, I think we actually have to ask what the purpose of a city is. Let me put a single premise on the table. A core purpose of a city is to bring people together in healthy connection. It's clear that doing this in cities has enormous and measurable benefits in terms of innovation, in terms of cultural richness, in terms of social health, and in terms of environmental health, and in terms of wealth. This issue of the quality of what I call shared inhabitation is being under-considered in city planning. The profession tends to be narrowly obsessed with form and use, with zoning focused on those two issues almost exclusively. However, if we start from a people-centric position on city and building making, we can generate other approaches. Our office is exploring and advancing two of these approaches, one at the city scale and one at the building scale. The city scale one is one we call urban magnets. Now, in a spectacular case of bad timing, myself and my co-authors of the Urban Magnets book, Mark Holland and Bruce Irvin, self-published our Urban Magnets books and received our lovely hard cover copies in February of 2020. So a book about shared activity as a way of activating public space arrived on our desk just at the same time when the whole issue of people getting together in public space became dangerous because of COVID. So we haven't had a book launch yet, but you can buy it on Amazon. Urban Magnets started with an inspirational question that Mark Holland brought to the table around the success of Granville Island. His question was this: how is it that Granville Island succeeded when so many other Granville Island knockoffs like Bridgepoint and Richmond failed? We would argue that this is a case where market forces and economics and function were viewed too narrowly. What people saw when they looked at Granville Island with an eye to replicating its success was location, waterfront, and a use, fresh food market. What they failed to see was that Granville Island could be thought of as an ecosystem of shared passions made visible. These Granville Island-based passions or activity magnets are food, art, and boating, and each have multiple expressions. On Granville Island, each of these urban magnets have 5 components that support their particular activity focus. They all have retail, which is essential to the economic success of placemaking. They all have education. Education does not have to be formal. Sunday morning kayak classes count. They all have events. The island is full of organized food, arts, and boating gathering opportunities. They all have visible fabrication. And this is a tricky one because it so often gets wiped out by a highest and best use thinking of economics. We believe visible fabrication is essential to authenticity. It counts that you can see Lee's Donuts getting made. Last, the urban design of the island embeds multiple visible celebrations of these three magnet activities. You can trip over the giant propeller on Duranlo Street, for example. Astute listeners will note that only the last is purely focused on built form. Our Urban Magnets book fleshes this out and grounds the thinking in a core idea that in the 21st century, activity is core to human connection, and visible expression of shared passion can be a driver of urban utility. This means you don't always need to spend a ton of money on fancy buildings to make your city better. I could talk for hours on this. You can just order the book. Or if you're super nice and reach out to me, I can send you a hard copy, which is much nicer than the book in Amazon. Next, our building scale area of research and practice is fluid sociability, a public good and open source software tool. Our fluid work originally came from a project I led with my former firm, Dialogue. This was at downtown East Side Strathcona Library with the YWCA run Cause We Care housing over. The latter is long-term housing for women with children, some fleeing violent partners. So it's a very vulnerable population. The site is a 100-foot by 120-foot site in the mid-block on the south side of Hastings in the downtown East Side. Those of you in the development world know that the way we almost always lay out these kinds of projects is to have a concrete box to house a street level use. And on top of that box, build a strip of housing facing the street, Hastings in this case, and a strip of housing behind with a shared corridor. Not awesome in terms of sociability in our view. In the design process, we generated many other options, one of which was essentially a stacked townhouse option with units looking into an elevated shared courtyard. You step out of your unit and see the front doors of most of your neighbors. We knew this was going to be hugely better in terms of sociability, but we couldn't prove it. And this option did have more exterior wall area than the double-loaded corridor version. In the end, the measurable metric that affected building cost won out over social connectedness. And we had no way of quantifying the human connection advantages. There are a lot of problems in the world that are super hard to fix. We decided we could help fix this one. With seed funding from BC Housing and a grant from the largest public health foundation in the US, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we set out to build a simulation tool to help us understand how building design affects our likelihood of meeting our neighbors. We realized that video games have people moving around buildings all the time and decided to try to steal from that technology. It didn't quite work out that simply, but our software build partners, Distance, a local firm, built what I think of as an AI light system to help. Let me show it to you. And you thought you were probably going to get away without slides, but I'm going to share my screen now. So I assume one of you will yell at me if you can't see this, but first of all, this is the back to Urban Magnets. This is just to prove you that we did in fact write a book, even though we haven't done a book launch. And yes, you can buy it on Amazon. So after that shameless plug, let's talk about fluid sociability. Fluid sociability is based on this idea of just for residential buildings, though we're going to expand it beyond that. We've created a simple spatial categorization system, a route finding system that populates the building and assumes how people move around it. And we've created 3 series of ideas about social interaction. The first is an encounter, which is simply the opportunity to encounter and understand one another. A greeting, which is where you and I would greet each other, and a conversation. This moves from something we know a lot about, which is how people move around the building, to quite speculative, but it's an idea. We looked at route finding, which includes things like sunlight. We know that when you're moving around a building and it's a courtyard, you're more likely to go outside if it's sunny. For greeting, it's much more about things like how people in buildings interact. We know, for example, that people with dogs are more likely to greet each other than people without dogs. We know that if you're on a crowded SkyTrains platform, you're much less likely to greet people than if you're in a smaller, more intimate environment. Conversations, we looked at a whole bunch of different things. And all of this is speculative, but we think it's quite supportable, and we're working with the UBC psychology department to get this right. So this is our fluid website, which you can go on, but I'm going to just spend one more minute and show you the actual software. So this is two projects. This is a project called Vienna House, an advanced BC housing project done by public design. And you can see what we've done is we ingest the program into our things, and we can turn on things like suites. We can understand how the circulation of the building works and those kinds of things. And we can zoom in and see it. But what's most important about this is we can start to see encounters. And encounters these are what we call these are kind of yellow lasers that indicate where two people can see each other as they move around the building. So that's interesting. I want you to look at this number. This is the double loaded corridor solution for Vienna House. And you can see in this one, 2.51 encounters per agent per day. This is simply your likelihood of running into your neighbors on the course of an average day. And then this is the courtyard version, same population, same site. And if we turn on the encounters version after running our simulation, what you can see is there's just a much higher density of yellow, which simply means in this building form, you are going to have the opportunity to contact your neighbor more frequently than the other one. And you can see down to this side that we go up by 3.88, which is, all of these are not real numbers, they're comparative numbers. Well, what it says is this building is dramatically better in terms of sociability than the others. And we know that at the design stage. And the best way I think about this is that when I started my career, the green building period was in its early stages. And we used to think that, I just got to clock in this. We used to think that, if I stop share, what we used to think about the green buildings is that you just throw solar panels and non-toxic paint and you're done. You've got a green building. And a whole series of standards like LEED, for example, started to grapple with a genuine issue about how buildings affect the environment, which is a complex and rich issue that requires real careful thought. Our belief as a studio is that the next frontier for this is really around sociability. So we're trying to really understand how building design affects sociability, because sociability is key to resilience and it's key to reducing loneliness, which is something we care about a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. A very thoughtful and very innovative approach to, never seen that before. Thank you for sharing that and for the innovative work that you do. Our next speaker is Oliver Hartleben. And Oliver really has an international perspective, originally from Switzerland, architectural graduate, city planner with public administration degree from Harvard Kennedy School, focused on involving policy, urban design, built form, public outreach. Oliver has worked for 25 years in planning, architecture, transportation, currently working on interdisciplinary IBI group projects in the United States and Canada. I would just like to point out one of my favorites, Cambry Gardens, which is where Pearson Hospital used to be. And I spent a lot of time there. It's amazing the work you're doing there. Congratulations. Oliver's conducted research on urban design, mobility, housing topics, taught at different public universities, private universities the last 4 years, teaching the design guidelines course at SFU City Program, currently leads IBI's group, West Coast Urban Planning and Urban Design Practice. Before coming to North America, he worked for many years with the city of Guatemala, lastly as a city planning director, where he oversaw the planning of the city's first bus rapid transit line, complete revision of the zoning and subdivision ordinances. Oliver, very honored to have you speaking at our Urban Lunch.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. And let me share my screen here. And I'm going to talk about my prior experience. So this, let me see. I hope you can see my screen. And about my prior experience in the city of Guatemala. And it goes to this notion that Bruce mentioned at the beginning, this crisis of overregulation or overlapping regulation, right? And how you can generate open information. And that's exactly what we had there. And as Alain Berthaud says in his book, and I believe that is true, you cannot regulate good urban design. So the question is, what do you regulate so that you leave to solutions like the ones that Bruce showed that actually can help us can help us move along with the objectives of the regulation. And so let me get you to a brief tour of this and how we incorporated the market into our planning, into our design of the regulation. So the first thing is we inherited 30 years worth of accumulated urban regulations. There was no map. So the first thing we did was we actually mapped this, and we had overlapping regulations in some instances, contradictory, and in some instances there was no regulation at all in certain areas of the city. So I was tasked to do this, to bring order into this chaos through a new instrument that was created legally, which was called the POT. And just to make things clear, we're not talking about the plant nor the kitchen utensil. It comes from the Spanish Plan de Ordenamiento Territorial, basically a comprehensive subdivision, zoning, and land use regulation. Now, our main objective, there were secondary objectives, the ones that Alain doesn't like about planners, but the main objective was, and he will like this one, which was reducing, how economists say, negative externalities. And in the case of Guatemala, there were two. First, minimizing the natural disaster risks, which were concentrated primarily in the ravines that crisscross the city, about 30% of the city's land area, and then reduce land use nuisances in terms of bulk or in terms of land use that we would say. And you would say like, hey, let's not regulate anything else because either the market will take care of it or specific design actions throughout the very localized design actions could take care of that. And a little bit of more on that in a second. So we wanted flexibility so that the individual projects could adapt to changing conditions. Rather than imposing a corset, we wanted to create a sandbox in which the players of creating a city could play. And that sandbox required processes. 80% of the regulations is about processes. What do you do, how, right? About rules, what you can or you can't do, and about boundaries within which you could play. I'll show some of these. Another important aspect is that we didn't want this to be an ossified regulation that didn't change over time. And I stole this from Jens van Bergman's and Nathaniel Lauster's presentation in a prior urban lunch, where you can see how basically the 1930s zoning is still in place. And the only way the market has had the chance to really, the regulation has had chance to adapt to the market is through the spot zoning in these teal areas, where each one is individual and not necessarily aligned with the original intent. In our case, the intent, remember, was to minimize externalities. So our solution was to generate 5 general zones that were that allowed many things within them and that were really flexible. But the key aspect in this for all the users, for landowners, for developers, for real estate agents, for buyers, for designers, was that we should have the essence of the regulation fit in 2 pieces of paper. Before we started writing a single word on the regulation, we said, okay, let's define these 2 things, which are user-centered. One map that tells you where things are. Remember, there was no map before. And a set of parameter tables where you could see everything that is allowed and the process that applies for either subdividing, building, or using a property. Now, the key question for us was, how are we going to design this thing if we have zero or almost zero market information? Unlike here, where municipalities or regional agencies spend years and a lot of money in understanding what is the demand, where are the growth, we had basically nothing. So we had to make it adaptable as much as possible from the get-go. So what did we do? We did 8 things, and let me go through them one by one relatively quickly. The first one is we try to align where density goes broadly, where higher market prices you would expect. And so that means less in the ravines because of the topography and because of the risk, more near major road network, and even more in the central areas in 3 concentric circles around the city. The second thing we did is, rather than us playing God and saying, oh, this is the polygon where G3 zone should go, we defined objective quantifiable criteria based on the things that produce the most value. It may be too simplistic, but the key aspect was, again, the ravines and the roads. So depending on the right of way and basically the capacity of mobility, we assigned in decreasing ranges the higher density ranges moving away from each one of those roads. And that allowed the map to self-generate itself. And so this is the result. First, we excluded the 30% of the ravines and the adjoining areas based on a criteria of slope, and that's 30%, mostly what you see in green here. And then the other piece was going from red to yellow, the other general zones. The interesting thing is that this map is not printed, but it's always flexible, because what's applicable in the regulation is the criteria of distance to road. So if a new road gets built, the map changes accordingly. So it's a dynamic map. It was really funny when we first unveiled it, developers went out and just photographed the map because they wanted to have the information. But in reality, it's a digital map. It's never the same. It's always changing. The fourth thing that we implemented is 4 interlinked density tiers. And what was interesting here is that it had a base FAR, and it also had an extended FAR. But the extended FAR, which was 50% of the base FAR, was also the base of the next tier. So basically, you could attain the same density within your G zone without necessarily changing them, although you could do that. I'll show you how. Now, the question is, okay, that's that extra 50% of extended FAR. With what could you fill it? Well, you could fill it with transfer of development right. Think of, for example, a part of the parcel that you couldn't use because it's in a ravine. Well, you could transfer to the rest of the lot. You could use it through incentivable practices. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Or you could move the FAR of a dedication of a road there. Or you could go beyond your FAR, your density, by choosing a different process. So I'll show you a bit of that in our next one. And so we included a series. These are some of our tables. So on the rows, you had all the parameters for the 3 cycles of transformation of land, and in the columns we have different procedures. So the procedures was the one on the left was as of right, and the other ones included either the zoning boards plus the neighbors plus council, and making it increasingly more difficult. But you could attain extended aspects, for example, a higher building by going through that process. But the choice was left to the individual person to do that. So there was another flexibility where the whole thing expanded and contracted depending on the choices of the individual actors. And as I said, all in one document. Now, in addition, there was more flexibility at the neighborhood level. Here we're zooming in at the local level. So if a built up neighborhood level, you could also change, there were part of the processes, you could do a local area plan in which you could move one zone up or one zone down. So here's where you could adapt to the necessities of the individual logics and dynamics of the neighborhood without completely throwing outside, like in the CD zones in Vancouver, the whole logic of the underlying plan. Then for greenfield and brownfield and grayfield sites that were plots larger than 1 hectare, we had pre-assigned the bands of the G zones, and those were defined depending on the road network. So if the developer put in wider roads, more connectivity, they would get more density, if less, then less. Again, align loosely with the market, and an incentive to actually complete the road network, which is one of the main problems within the city. Both area plans, both the neighborhood and the developable and the CD areas also could modify within certain ranges the parameters in the table, so that you could shift a little bit the parameters in the table, again, adding flexibility to the process without generating yet another complicated mechanism as an overlay zone, et cetera, that we know from North America. And finally, the eighth aspect where we included flexibility as part of the design is the incentives. I already talked about the incentives having the ability to add up to 50% more density, but you could also reduce your license fees by 50%. And this was all linked to a points-based formula. So there were about 10 or 11 what we called incentivable practices, things that we wanted developers to do. And they were all points-based and linked to a G zone. For example, in G5, we wanted a little bit more transparency. So the number of points was higher there, and the factor corresponds to the density. The good thing about this is that the point scheme could be easily fixed. You could add new incentivable practices, etc., without generating completely different. So it was built for flexibility and adaptability. So these are the 8 things that we did. Now you will maybe be asking, you know what, and how did it go? The good thing is that this has been in effect about 10 years. So we already know that some things worked and some things didn't. The good thing is that I don't work with the city anymore, so I can also talk about the things that didn't, which to my mind is where real learning occurs. So I don't want to go through all of them, but it was really accepted from the good side. It was really accepted by the market. Not many changes have happened. Most cases, more than 80% of the cases go through the simple process, the as of right process. There is a faster and simpler processing. So normal development permit, we went down from 105 to 35 days for approval. Tried to do that in Vancouver. Rejection rates went down. The number of application forms came down from 29 to 5, and most cases you just need 1. And all of that made the World Bank put this initiative in their best practices and success story in their doing business report in 2015. But the most important thing, and Bruce mentioned it at the beginning when he said open information, it was information symmetry. All of a sudden, everybody was talking the same language. Whoever owned land, whoever sold land, whoever wanted to build on land, etc. So that was the main advantage. However, not everything worked out well. There were things that we didn't include. For example, the issue of affordability, an important issue right now, was excluded, although the mechanisms exist to do that. Unfortunately, there were ossified exclusive residential areas. That was my negotiation chip to get that through council. So there's about 17 exclusive residential areas that are not the whole city, are much less than the single family residential areas in Vancouver. But that was included there. The incentive have not yet been updated, although the mechanism exists. And some of the large developments have been case-by-case negotiations on the political level. And rather than giving them a special permit, right, some aspects of the regulation have been changed. For example, the minimum area of area plans have increased from 1 hectare to 3 hectares. So basically allowing gated communities within those 3 hectares to happen, or changes to road dedications. And of course, the specter of NIMBYism everywhere. We thought that in conflictive aspects, it was good to involve neighbors. And I think that one thing that we didn't anticipate is that we should have spent more time in training, capacity building, citizen ownership, etc., because it's not only the regulation that works. So what I say, you can design and have the best car, but in the end, it's the driver who drives that car, right? And the drivers of this regulation have their own completely different ways of going about it than we do here in Vancouver. And so we should have anticipated that and put more effort into real outreach. Even though we did a lot of outreach, I think we should have done much more outreach. And then yet the results, when you go back and you take an example of this boulevard in a upper middle class neighborhood in Guatemala, you can see how in 10 years, much of the density has occurred along the main road. Some larger buildings are in the background. They have all been negotiated. It has been a process that has not been that conflictive. And even though this doesn't have a bus rapid transit line, that's the place where it is planned to be. So in the end, all is more compatible in that sense. You can have more of the non-residential uses are usually along the boulevard, and this is probably the best example of the results of this. So with that, I thank you, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Oliver. I will just mention to everyone that Sebastian Zane, you can direct message him or put any of your questions on the chat, and we'll be able to accommodate those later. Thank you for that presentation. I think about cities in the developing world and other countries. Two interesting points is that they do, in some ways, give us a more raw, experience with processes that we have that we don't. It's harder to see some of the the big processes that are going on. And the other thing, it gives us an opportunity to innovate. And it's so fascinating to see how you found a way to try to accommodate market forces within a planning regime. So I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Gordon Price. And I had the first time I met Gordon was when I was a city councillor with him. And it was so interesting for me to watch in front of my eyes the idea of cycling as a real legitimate part of the city. And most people, staff and councillors, thought he was nuts at the time. And you know what? He was relentless about this. And when I look around and see the incredible bicycle infrastructure, I think back to those days when, Gordon, you were the one that pioneered and championed that against a lot of odds. So thank you for that. 6 terms as city councillor. Then he was the director of the city program. And one of the interesting hobbies he had was something called price tags. And he would wander around the world and send these little wonderful pictures and insights into cities. And that became more and more popular, and it became the go-to place for urbanists. And that's now been recently reformed into Viewpoint Vancouver, a fascinating place to get urban information. Thank you for creating that, Gordon. And please give us your presentation.
Hey, thanks, Sam. Yeah, listen to the people who are nuts. Always good advice. Okay, I got 3 points to make. Yep, just 3. Governance, particularly local government, is largely about regulating the rate of change. Notice I did not say change, I said rate of change. Politics is about understanding and responding to your constituents' perception of the rate of change. Perception of the rate of change. And the results that we can measure now for the last half century in Vancouver and Metro resulted in what I just generically call the grand bargain. So to go back to the rate of change, this is where I think where Alan's insights into the nature of markets and their importance is most relevant. And I do listen to many of the dialogues that go on about the housing market, and particularly on the left, but not entirely. There is a presumption that government should be more involved to the point where it can replace the housing market, the market. It's not taken too seriously, and for good reason, because that's not going to happen. But really, I think they're talking more about the rate of change, not the change itself. And they want government to intervene, in particular, to do something that goes to the second point, the perception of the rate of change and ultimately what the best rate would be. I'll give you a little Priceism that I evolved when I was on council. I began to realize that in the neighborhoods that are most anxious about change, the rate of change is often actually slow. In fact, slower than it previously was. My own neighborhood, the West End, would be a great example. Massive change in the 1960s. Man, we went in there with bulldozers, a couple of hundred high-rises in about 10 years, and that was a rate of change. But the anxiety level really only increased after the neighborhood had a chance to settle down. Once it was downzoned, people had a chance to stay because they had tenure of some kind, whether as renters, some kind of rent control, as leaseholders, as owners. They had some sense of security. And it was at that point that they would really become acute to change in their neighborhood. You would think it would be just the opposite. It's not. Once a neighborhood has a chance to settle in, and again, it doesn't matter whether it's a kind of neighborhood full of people who look like me, old white guys on the west side, or a hipper neighborhood like Grandview, or even the downtown east side. Once people have that tenure, once they have a real stake, a sense of continuity in their neighborhood, that's when their perception of rate of change becomes much more, shall we say, political. That's where they want government intervention. They want someone to deal with that anxiety about the rate of change, even if it's slower than what it was. Yeah. And often that's why these layers of regulation and process, you're responding to this anxiety in the community. That's your job. You're a politician. And you're very often successful. People say you can't stop change. Well, actually, yeah, no, you can. We did it in the West End. I would like to say I can walk down streets in my neighborhood and I can point to every building and nothing was built after about 1985. Not a thing. So it's possible to do. Now, other issues happen, of course, affordability, etc. But doesn't change the anxiety. Doesn't change the political necessity. And the way that this has resolved itself, yeah, I'd say resolved itself in this region as a whole for the last half century, 50 years, whether it was reflected in the Livable Region Plan or the kind of way we do development generally, that's what I call the grand bargain. And the grand bargain was this, and you could really see it in Guatemala, actually. That was a great example, that boulevard. Oh, there's the grand bargain. I totally get it. Ossification of the neighborhoods. That was the politicians responding to anxiety over the rate of change. And the agreement that they come into, so really fascinating presentation there, Oliver. Never seen that kind of detail. But it basically goes through the same thing. How can we slow down that rate of change and maintain the security of tenure, the scale and character of a neighborhood, by allowing density to occur in those places where A, we think it should be, but more B, we can get away with it. We can get away with it in old industrial lands. We can get away with it on arterials. We can get away with it in places where the people aren't likely to respond politically. They don't want their neighborhood disrupted. They don't want to have a sense that they might lose their tenure, their relationships, those things that we call community. We're into Jane Jacobs land here. Yeah, and politically, you got to respond to that, right, left, or center. Watch what happens with the Vancouver plan. The idea that we will have overlays of zoning that will fundamentally change in some way some neighborhoods' character, the scale. I don't believe it will happen. I believe that they will do what we have done so successfully. We will find those areas where we can accommodate density and we will pile it up. We call them mega projects. That's what my councils did in the 1990s. What the Livable Region Plan led to in places like Burnaby, calling it Burnabyism now too. They chose apartment districts and old industrial sites along the old rail line or brought in SkyTrain, along Lougheed Highway. Look at those cities that arise from that forest, that plain of suburban green, and then produce, I think, a form of mixed-use density, call it Vancouverism, Burnabyism, that has worked pretty well for us. It allows a scale of development, thousands of housing units a year, that can't be met by the tweaking of invisible, hidden, or gentle density. And it more really allows market forces to come into play. We also use these areas as a way of extracting benefit to pay for the amenity so we don't burden the existing property taxpayers. It's my loaded word, burden, but again, politically. So where I would depart, as others do, with Oliver is the idea that somehow planners will replace the market, and no. if that's going to happen, it will be a political exercise and it won't be decided by the planners. They may interfere with it, they think in a way, but they still are directed by and large by the political directions of council. And if what they are doing is slowing down the rate of change, as much as that might be called red tape, as much as everyone will agree, no, we shouldn't have these impediments in the way of the kind of development we want. No, that's there for a reason. It helps us regulate the rate of change, that political necessity, which won't go away. So you may call it ossification on one hand. It's maintaining scale and character of an existing neighborhood and respecting the people who live there, or those who have tenure or want tenure. And then you've got these corridors or these mega projects. Sanok is the latest example here in Vancouver that allow you to really sock in the density in a way, yes, that provides more amenity, transport. You do it, try and do it right. And I think over the last 50 years, we've learned a thing or two about how to do that right. You will not get consensus on that point, but I believe you will get, it may not be stated consensus, but it will be an agreement across the political spectrum. The government will intervene in markets in order to regulate the rate of change. And local governments will respond politically to anxiety over rate of change. And they will ultimately move, I think, towards either a continuation or a reiteration, or in some cases, a renegotiation of the grand bargain. We will protect the leafy greenness of your community. We will slow down the rate of change so that you are not disrupted by it. So that the purpose of zoning, you know what your neighbor can build, will still stay in place. That assumption that you have when you make a major investment emotionally and financially into your community. And that grand bargain in turn will allow us to accommodate growth on a scale that a region like ours has to provide ultimately. Now, there are all kinds of nuances to this, but I think those three things still hold, certainly the product of my political experience. Governance is about the rate of change. We will intervene in markets. Politically, you will respond to your community, regardless of the nature of that community, once they have a sense of continuity. And there is a way to do it successfully. I call it the grand bargain. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Gordon. I want to see one day a book called Priceisms. And Burnaby.
A book, yeah, a book, right.
A book, yeah, no, Burnabyism is my latest favorite, but actually my truly latest favorite is Listen to the People Who Are Nuts. Thanks for that the most recent Priceism. You saw it live yourself right in front of your eyes. Thank you, Gordon.
Thanks,
now we have just a few minutes for some questions, and Sebastian, but I'd like to also mention Eric Villagomez, who is running Spacing Vancouver, go-to site for urbanists, has put a lot of this information on the Miro board there. So I urge you to check out all of the Urban Lunch information. So Sebastian, take it away.
Well, thank you, Oliver, Bruce, and Gordon. Awesome to hear such a diversity of perspectives and areas of expertise. So I like design questions. John Fountain has asked you, Bruce, what's your favorite example of a stacked townhouse project with an internal courtyard?
Oh, I can't answer that one specifically because I haven't seen a ton of them. What I can say is my favorite example of a townhouse project with a courtyard is the one I live in, which is the one that Sam referenced, Goose Corner, because we just get to wander out and know our people. And so it's not a direct courtyard environment, but it's actually a case of a redevelopment, to use Sam's historic term, of eco-density on a small site with a shared backyard. And it's great from a sociability perspective.
What do you think about stacked townhouses in general as a means for facilitating greater socialization among residents, less atomization, or are they part of the solution?
I think all sorts of forms are part of the solution. Our goal isn't like we sometimes get accused, or not accused, but we are passionate about the courtyard form example. We do think the courtyard form is a social housing, is a more sociable form of housing in general, not always, by the way. And for example, the standard arterial zoning in the C2 to City of Vancouver makes the Courier form extremely difficult. So we're not really about this form is the solution. We're really about trying to understand sociability in a more rigorous way so that we can, in fact, have sociability occur alongside other considerations. So we're not saying stacked townhouse is the only way to go. In a particular example that I gave you, we thought it would have been a better solution than what it was, but it's not the only one.
Great, thank you. Question from Christine Elliott. This can go to all of you. She's asked, how does urban green space fit into the frameworks you three have outlined?
I guess I'll jump in because I don't see Gordon and Bruce jumping into this. And going to our example, one of the interesting things is that in Guatemala you had a third of the city being ravines, but they were much like riverfronts in North America. They were not there, right? Because they were behind buildings, etc. And so one of the aspects was, how can we make this protected, but at the same time valuable economically, so that they were protected and they were not developed. And so including that was a big aspect. One important thing compared to other places like here is that usually green spaces were fully privatized. So whenever you did a residential development, the green space was fully privatized, right? And so we put it as an incentive if you gave land for that use. But interestingly enough, and going back to market forces, right? There's, to my knowledge, not a single new green space having occurred through that incentive. It is probably, you can either argue A, you're giving too little for that to happen, or B, culturally, what people want is to own their own green space, not unlike the little parks in the residential areas in the 19th century in London, right? That were fully private, right? Yeah, but clearly there's a deficit, and we put in some aspects there, but definitely this is something that is lacking. And at the scale, which was at the city scale, wasn't good. At the local scale, there was one plan that was implemented, and that included a space for that to be included. It's not built yet, but it's successful. But clearly, more density will require more green space, and so I believe we deal with that much better here. Not only because we have a lot of more green spaces, but every master plan we design in our office includes a substantial amount of new green space that usually is dedicated to the city. Completely different conditions, different problems, and everybody sees the value in that. So there's a difference in perception about what green space is and what it should do, and whether it's for everyone or not for everyone.
I'll jump in here. I presume Christine, hi Christine, is talking about public green space. Yeah, let's pull out the regulation, 2.75 acres per thousand. That was established on the major projects, and the park board fights hard to maintain that. But I think the green space that actually shapes the city is the one that Oliver's talking about, but not in the sense where it is fully privatized. That public expression of class, the front yard, the inheritance we have from the Garden City, yeah, that's the one that counts. And it's a quasi-public private space, maintained privately as an expression of the private, but it shapes the streetscape. And we care a lot about that. It's the reason why Houseman's Paris, I've had this argument with my co-editor, Sandy, and no front lawns won't work for us. As though we do densify, you can see it in downtown South, then we move that front yard truly into the public realm, into the street. And at that point, we just sock in the street trees. We create urban forests. You can see it quite dramatically in downtown South now. That, I think, is going to be the future, particularly as the number of vehicles, which I think in the traditional sense will happen, and there will be more opportunity to do that.
Thank you all. We have about 2 more minutes, and I want to give, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, can I jump in? Because I see Ann McAfee is with us, and I would be reticent or mistaken not to note that Anne, who has her own degree in land economics, would make the point that our department is pretty well versed in what I think Alain has made the point we need more of. And indeed, there are many, many things that we did the public really wasn't cognizant of because it was really kind of the backstory stuff. It was particularly financing growth and the economics that we looked at when we were doing things like the mega projects, and indeed inherent in the whole community amenity contributions. That is deeply rooted in economics. So that is very much part of how we do business. It's certainly not extant from City Hall.
Thank you for that, Gordon. Okay, so we have 1 more minute. First of all, I'd like to just say September 9th, we're going to have Wendy Waters and some others presenting. Please join us for the urban lunch. Also, I'd just like to acknowledge that through politics, I learned that when somebody does a really good thing, you always try to take credit for it. And I just want to acknowledge that Lynn Zanata has been managing these public urban lunches, and it's terrifying, you know, what we go through just to make sure it looks like everything is going smoothly. But there's been some amazing things that had to be done, and I just want to acknowledge her. And now I'd like to ask Alain to say a final word today. Thank you, Alain.
Well, thank you for inviting me. For me, this is a learning experience. You know, Vancouver is a major city that I have never visited, so to my shame. So for me, it's a way of learning. What I like particularly during those 3 presentations is first, Bruce, the scale of urban design. This is something that I have not addressed in my book, but it's extremely important. You know, the way people interact at between street and building, and I wish I had. And the second, the presentation of Oliver, I think that for me, one of the major things that he points is information symmetry. You know, again, market cannot work if there is no information symmetry, if everything is hidden and could be negotiated. And I think that one of the, let's say, the advantage of this plan is that it's clear why things are that way, and how you can negotiate slight change. And then, of course, Gordon, the rate of change. Yes, this is a major, I think, problem in modern democracy, that most people normally do not want any change, although they benefited from change by moving to the city eventually. So this is a conundrum, but I think that to express it that way is a very, very useful way. How do you address it politically? So thank you very much again. I've been just here for learning, and I think I get my learning for 1 hour. That was very nice.
Thank you, Alain, for inspiring all of this. And all of us are sending our love to you and Marie-Agnès in your challenge. And we thank you for inspiring these urban lunches, and we look forward to you joining us in Vancouver. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I know. Welcome to our 4th of 5 urban lunches in the lead up to the Alain Berthaud Public Salon on September 20th at the Vancouver Playhouse. The agenda today, we're going to have 3 wonderful speakers, very diverse in their points of view and the perspective, where they come from. And we've had over 110 people registered as of this morning. So we're really pleased at how much interest there is on these 3 people. I want to make a special thanks to Devin Harlos, who is a member of our organizing committee. And she was the one who arranged that anybody who's a member of the Architectural Institute of BC and the Planning Institute of BC will be getting professional development credits for attending this and the September 20th event. So that is a really wonderful contribution from Devin Harlos. And she is also a well regarded urban artist who has some wonderful streetscapes that she's designed that we actually are having one hung in our place. So thank you. And we have Sebastian Zane as well, who is going to be managing the question and answer at the end. He is with Urbanics, or he's just completing his role and he's going off into a new life. But we thank him for his participation and all the support he's given as the chair of our organizing group. So this is the fourth of 5 urban lunches in the lead up to Alain Berthaud's public salon on September 20th, the Vancouver Playhouse. Alain Berthaud is an internationally acclaimed urban planner, and he and his wife, Marie-Agnès, who has an expertise in satellite imagery, have worked in cities around the world, especially in his role as principal urban planner for the World Bank. It always helps when you show up to a city with billions of dollars of loans and being able to have a special insight into a city. Alain's first job was working for none other than Le Corbusier, his design of the Chandigarh capital of Punjab. Not many people can say that as a first job. He has summarized his insights from his lifetime of work in a book called Order Without Design, which is being well received around the world. And we are so pleased that for the 4th time in 4 urban lunches, both Alain and Marie-Agnès are joining us. This is unbelievable. We are so honored that they would be so interested in Vancouver and what we're doing, that they would join on these sessions. I have to make a serious announcement that we are having a revision to our plans. Marie-Agnès has been given a medical diagnosis recently. That means that she and Alain will be working as they always do, as a team, to regain health. And this combined with COVID cases, the rising COVID cases, means Alain will be participating on the big screen September 20th in conversation with 6 local urbanists. All of the other community events will take place next year. The public salon, we're now making this as an opportunity to organize even better events and gatherings. For example, they were scheduled to meet all of the planning directors of Metro Vancouver municipalities. We're going to speak in the council chambers to Vancouver city staff, and they're going to do workshops with a number of students. These will take place next year. So that's the big revision here. In the meantime, all of us are going to be sending our love and support and all the positive feelings we can muster to Marie-Agnès and Alain as they face this challenge. At the September 20th public salon will be several speakers, several urbanists who will be in conversation and present with Alain. We will have Chris Lewis of the Squamish First Nation. Now, for those who were at the last urban lunch, he gave an outstanding presentation with him and David Negrin about these really quite significant developments with SNOC. And we gave a very good presentation on that, and also the many different indigenous developments that are going around the city, and a very significant development here of what's going on in Vancouver. We will also have Julia Harton. She is a SCARP UBC professor, planning professor. If anybody was for our second urban lunch, they will remember that she took place. She was participating from a beach in Greece, where you can almost hear the waves, preparing for her wedding. She didn't have the gown on exactly yet, but there she was. So what incredible commitment to the whole program. Wendy Waters is a historian and real estate researcher. She'll be also part of that. Michael Mortensen, who is a former city planner and now works in city planning for development projects. So he's got very interesting perspectives. Jens von Bergman, if you were at the first urban lunch, you saw he's a remarkable data visualization specialist. And he presented some fascinating visual presentations on what is happening to Vancouver in the last number of years. Then we'll have Andrei Pavlov of SFU, is finance and economics. So, and please note that the PIBC and AIBC will still be giving professional development credits for any member who attends the September event. And I must say that while we're waiting for Alain and Marie-Agnès to arrive, while we're waiting for them to arrive in next year, we are going to have one urban lunch per month. So we're going to keep these going until we get them back to health and in Vancouver. So so let's get on with the three outstanding urbanists who are making a real difference to our city. So our first presenter will be Bruce Haden. And Bruce is the co-founder of Human Studio Architecture and Urban Design. He has been contributing to the design of this region for many years with work with prior firms ranging from J.J. Bean at 14th and Main to the UBC Student Nest. When I go to our local J.J. Bean, I feel like I'm in the brain of Bruce Haden. It's quite an experience. He is a founding board member of Urbanarium, is passionate about this group. It's a key tool for enhancing the quality of urban discussion. He's currently contributing to cross-Canada architectural discussion. And he's got a role now, I didn't know about this, but is the jury chair for the Block 2 International Design Competition in Ottawa, Parliament Hill. So our own Bruce Haden is actually responsible for that jury. One of my favorite projects that Bruce did was Coo's Corner. I used to, as a teenager, I used to deliver auto parts on my bicycle to Coo, and Coo had a mechanic shop, and it was such an amazing thing to watch how he transformed this old mechanic shop into Coo's Corner, where he now lives.